Now, let's grant that more output is a good thing. But it's also true that for most people, what they have to do to earn a living isn't a source of joy. Most people's jobs, after all, are such that they benefit not only from more goods and services, but also from a shorter working day and longer holidays. Just consider, if God gave all of us the pay we now get, and granted us freedom to choose whether or not to work at our present jobs for as long as we pleased, but for no extra pay, then there'd be a big increase in leisure time pursuits. So improved productivity makes two things possible. It makes possible either more output or less toil, or of course some mixture of both. But capitalism is biased in favor of the first option only, increased output, since the other, reduction of toil, threatens a sacrifice of the profit associated with greater output and sales. What does a firm do when the efficiency of its production improves? Well, it doesn't just reduce the working day of its employees and produce the same amount as before. Instead, it makes more stuff. It makes more of the goods it was already making. Or if that isn't possible, because the demand for what it's selling won't expand, then it lays off part of its workforce and seeks a new line of production in which to invest the money it thereby saves. Eventually, new jobs are created and output continues to expand, although there's a lot of unemployment and suffering along the way. Now, the consequence of the increasing output which capitalism favors is increasing consumption. And so we get an endless chase after consumer goods just because capitalist firms are geared to making money and not to serving the interests of consumers. Alfred P. Sloan, who once ran General Motors in the United States, said that it was the business of the automobile industry to make money, not cars. I agree, and that, I'm saying, is why it makes so many cars. It would make far fewer if its goal weren't money, but, say, providing people with an efficient and an inoffensive form of transport. If the aim of production were the satisfaction of need, then rather less would be produced and consumed than is in fact produced and consumed. And most of us would lead less anxious lives and have more time and energy for the cultivation and enjoyment of our own powers. Now, I'm not some kind of fanatical Puritan who's against consumer goods. I'm not knocking consumer goods. Consumer goods are fine. But the trouble with the chase after goods in a capitalist society is that we'll always, most of us, want more goods than we can get, since the capitalist system operates to ensure that people's desire for goods is never satisfied. Business, of course, wants contented customers, but they mustn't become too contented, since when customers are satisfied with what they've got, they buy less and work less, and business dwindles. That's why in a capitalist society, an enormous amount of effort and talent goes into trying to get people to want what they don't have. That's why there's feverish product innovation, huge investments in sales and advertising, and planned obsolescence. In order to keep going as a system, capitalism has to keep people on the go, and it creates a great deal of strain and nervous tension. The Rockefellers make sure that the Smiths need to keep up with the Joneses, and in a forlorn attempt to keep up, because not everybody can manage to keep up, people work their lives away and sometimes take extra jobs in order to buy things they don't have the time to enjoy because of the time they spend working to buy them. Well, in earlier periods of capitalist history, its preference for output conferred on the system a progressive historical role. Capitalism raised us above the scarcity imposed by nature under which pre-capitalist peasants labored. But as that natural scarcity recedes, the output preference renders capitalism reactionary. It can't realize the possibilities of liberation it creates. Having lifted the burden of natural scarcity, it contrives an artificial scarcity, which means that people never feel they have enough. Capitalism brings humanity to the very threshold of liberation and then locks the door. We get near it, but we remain on a treadmill, just outside it. Sometimes people fall off that treadmill, and recently in this country, that's happened on a large scale. I'm referring again to the problem of unemployment, which is now enormous in Britain. The same system that overworks people in the interest of profit also deprives them entirely of work when it's not profitable to employ them. And what we get as a result is not something that we could imagine, a reasonable amount of work and a balanced existence for everyone, but grotesque overemployment for some, together with rending unemployment for others. How can they say that this system satisfies human need when homeless people in Britain need housing and unemployed bricklayers need work? How can anybody think that it's a system that promotes human benefit when it projects the message that the only way to self-esteem is to be the owner of a BMW or at least a Ford Sierra? And then it throws millions of families into a destitution where they can barely afford sausages to feed their children. So I'm very skeptical about the claim that capitalism is so good at satisfying our needs as consumers. And anyway, people have needs which go beyond the need to consume. One of those needs will, because it's so important, occupy most of the rest of this talk. It's a person's need to develop and exercise his or her talents. When people's capacities lie unused, they don't enjoy the zest for life which comes when their faculties flourish. Now, people are able to develop themselves only when they get good education. But in a capitalist society, the education of children is threatened by those who seek to fit education to the narrow demands of the labor market. And some of them think that what's now needed to restore profitability to an ailing British capitalism is a lot of cheap, unskilled labor. And they conclude that education should be restricted to ensure that it'll supply that labor. The present Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nigel Lawson, said in a speech a couple of years ago that we should now think about training people for jobs which are, as he put it, not so much low-tech as no-tech. Now, what sort of education is contemplated in that snappy statement, not so much low-tech as no-tech? Not an education that nourishes the creative powers of young people and brings forth their full capacity. Nigel Lawson is saying that it's dangerous to educate the young too much because then we produce cultivated people who aren't suited to the low-grade jobs the market will offer them. An official at the Department of Education and Science recently said something similar. He said, and I'm here quoting his words, that we're beginning to create aspirations which society cannot match. When young people can't find work which meets their abilities and expectations, then we're only creating frustration with disturbing social consequences. We have to ration educational opportunities so that society can cope with the output of education. People must be educated once more to know their place. That's the end of the quote. Well, what have we got here? Something very frightening. We've got a policy of deliberately restricting educational provision so that state schools can produce willing sellers of low-grade labor power. It's hard to imagine a more undemocratic approach to education. And notice that to prefer a democratic distribution of educational opportunity, you don't have to believe that everyone is just as clever as everyone else. Nigel Lawson isn't saying that most people are too dim to benefit from a high level of education. It's precisely because people respond well to education that the problem which worries him arises. You see, there's a lot of talent in almost every human being. You can see it in kids. But in most people, that talent remains undeveloped, since they haven't had the time and the freedom and the facilities to develop it. Throughout history, only a leisured minority have enjoyed such freedom on the backs of the toiling majority. And that's been unavoidable up to now. But now, It's no longer unavoidable. We have a superb technology which could be used to restrict unwanted labor to a modest place in life. But capitalism doesn't use that technology in a liberating way. It continues to imprison people in largely unfulfilling work, and it shrinks from providing the enriching education which the technology it has created makes possible. Some supporters of British capitalism disagree with Lawson's idea that there's a danger that people will get too much education. They say that what the market now needs is a better trained labor force. Well, whoever's right about that, I'm confident that we shouldn't stake our children's future on the hope that the capitalist market will need what's good for them. The educational system shouldn't be subject to the capricious demands of capitalism, and it shouldn't cater to the tendency of capitalism to treat enormous numbers of people as nothing but sources of profit, and when they can't be profitably exploited, as redundant and expendable, because that's what the capitalist firm does. Is it possible to create a society which goes beyond the unequal treatment that capitalism imposes? Many would say that the idea of such a society is an idle dream. Many would agree with the negative things I've said about capitalism, but they'd say, look, there's no point getting upset about it. There's always been inequality of one kind or another, and there always will be. But I think that reading of history is too pessimistic. There's actually much less inequality now than there was, for instance, 100 years ago. 100 years ago, only a few radicals proposed that everybody should have the vote. Others thought that was a dangerous idea, and most would have considered it to be an unrealistic one. But today, we have the vote. We are a political democracy. But we're not an economic democracy. We don't share our material resources, and most people in this country would regard that as an unrealistic idea. Yet I'm sure it's an idea whose time will come. Society won't always be divided into those who control its resources and those who have only their own labor to sell. But it'll take a lot of thought to work out the design of a democratic economic order, and it'll take a lot of struggle against privilege and power to bring it about. We can't go back to being independent peasant communities, and even if we could, we'd be sacrificing the tremendous gains we owe to capitalism if we did so. Nor is anybody going to provide us with schmooze. The obstacles to economic democracy are considerable. But just as no one now would defend slavery or serfdom, I believe that a day will come when no one will be able to defend a form of society in which a minority profit from the dispossession of the majority.
An edited version